Physicians for Social Responsibility presents What Can the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Movement Learn from Other Social Justice Movements?
I'm Mari Faines. I am the Director of Communications and Outreach for here at PSR. And I want to thank you all for coming to the first event of our Demand Access series. What can the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Movement learn from other social justice movements? I want to give a quick thank you to my co-lead, Jasmine Owens, who's the lead organizer and policy coordinator of the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program, to Martin Fleck, who is the program director for the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program, and Jeff Carter, who is the executive director here at PSR. And we have some wonderful panelists here today. We have Scott Giberson, Rayna Rogers, and Nola Hayes, and Ola Farchinsky. I'm going to give their brief bio so you can all learn about these wonderful individuals. Rayna holds her master's in non-proliferation and terrorism studies from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, where she worked as a graduate research assistant at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Rogers later served as the founding content director for West Coast chapter of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. Rayna spent nearly a decade abroad teaching English and brings a wealth of knowledge to these important issues. Thank you so much, Rayna, for being here right now. Second, I want to introduce Ola Farchinsky. Ola is a current third-year medical student at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She's interested in the intersection between environmental externalities and health communities. Ola is studying urban medicine in the program with a focus in housing insecurity. She currently volunteers at Deborah's Place, an organization dedicated to providing women with housing security as well as educational opportunities. Along with a few other medical students, she hosts a bi-monthly educational session called Healthy Beats, with the goal of improving healthcare literacy and empowering women to be their own healthcare advocates. Scott Giberson is the co-founder of the training leadership team of Medicine Forward and a medical student at the University of North Carolina. In his current role with Medicine Forward, he manages a team of medical students and resides and residents that work to identify and address problems facing marginalized communities in medicine and hopes to impact these communities through their work with Medicine Forward and beyond. And finally, Nola Hayes. Nola is an adjunct professor of political science and international relations, teaching arms control and international security. Nola's research focuses on national security, foreign policy, and intersectionality, centering on the WMD threats in space, nuclear modernization, reduction, deterrence, and strategic planning. Nola is an active board member on the Women's Caucus for the International Studies Association's communication team and a foreign policy board member for American Political Science Association. Nola is the director of the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security West Coast chapter and is an alumnus of West Exec Advising Mentoring Program. She's also a member of the Pacific Council on International Policy. She is currently on the communications team for Black Professionals in International Security, BPIA. And Nola is a unique scholar in the national security space because of her multiple intersections between policy and communication. I want to thank you all so much for being here. And Nola, just to kick it off with you, we're here because we're talking about the ways that intersections meet between the nuclear weapons abolition movement and other social justice movements. One of your areas of expertise is identity-based issues. What are the ways that you think that these issues can affect security, specifically nuclear modernization, reduction, deterrence, and strategic planning?
Good morning. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I have been looking forward to this talk. That is not a small question. I think, I'll start with, I've been thinking a lot about what abolition means and thinking about the current state of international security and wondering if abolition could actually be realized. And one of the reasons why I say that is because I think a lot about how democratic backsliding has really, really impacted the ways in which coalition building has happened in the past. I know that the State Department, they are engaged in a lot of strengthening of coalitions. There was something that was just released yesterday regarding the PSI training that happened in Singapore. I know that there are a lot of people interested in the nuclear space right now, more probably around modernization. There are people like me who would love for us to focus on disarmament and abolition, but I think the realities of a very competitive global world right now, especially with China rising, in the missiles race with hypersonic weapons, I don't know how realistic abolition is at this point. However, what I will say is, I think that coalition building, multilateral treaties and pacts, I think that we need to lean more into that, because there really is a huge, it's an unevenness when we think about proliferation, when we think about the states that have nuclear capabilities versus the ones who do not. There are far more that do not have them. And most of those states are, have a lot of brown folks, let's just say it that way. So this is the way in which I think about identity. I think about identity in terms of the way that we foreign policy make, in terms of the way we make national security policy, who's being included, who are we securing, who has the power to secure. So I think that having really, really strong conversations about why only 9 states, well, there are only a few states that actually admit to having nuclear weapons, but we'll say 9. Why do those states look the way that they do? And that's how identity comes into all of this. And this is the last thing that I'll say about identity. And one of the things that I think about a lot is, because China is such a huge competitor right now, because of the success that they're having, the recent success that they had in testing a hypersonic weapon, the one thing that I would urge all policymakers, including myself, to do is not to policy make with bias in mind, to not policy make with fear in mind. There are those who think that we are already in a new Cold War, wanting to warn against a hot war with China. All that's fine. I just say, let's not bring identity, let's not bring anti-Asian sentiment into the way in which we make policy.
Thank you so much. And I think that actually touches really well on some of the work that I know Rayna has done recently, thinking about the conversations around equity and the way that we look at countries and they're racialized and their nuclear weapons. Do you want to talk a little about your work as a graduate student, Rayna, and what you learned in the ways that we racialize the conversations around nuclear weapons?
Sure. Once again, I'd like to echo what Nola said, and thanking you for having me on this panel. Excited to have the conversation and to talk to your questions specifically. So in one of my classes, global politics actually, we're discussing nuclear weapons and the countries who either possess them currently or possess them in the past. And one of them being South Africa, but it was South Africa during the apartheid. So you had a majority Black citizenry, but a majority white government. And so while I am thankful that they got rid of their nuclear weapons, we have to look at some of the rationale, possible rationale behind why they got rid of it. And the idea of leaving 6 nuclear weapons in the hands of all black government probably didn't sit well with some folks. And so while it's always good to see countries get rid of their nuclear weapons, I am one who believes that we need to get down to 0. We have enough conventional weapons to blow each other to kingdom come. The need to having actual nuclear weapons at this point, I don't really see it. But the conversation about like who gets to have them, who doesn't, even within the NPT, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, they are nuclear haves and have-nots, and it was based on whether or not you exploded a nuclear device before a certain date. But when you look at those individuals, the vast majority of them are from Western countries. And so it creates an unequal dynamic when it comes to these weapons arsenals.
They all go to like middle barriers.
Somebody else. And so, yeah, I just think that there are questions and there are motivations that aren't strictly based on like security concerns, but there are racialized ones. Because even if you look at South Asia and India and Pakistan and their possession of nuclear weapons, how like that is discussed, whether or not they are considered to be like good stewards of their nuclear arsenal compared to the same conversations that were had in the past when France or the UK developed their nuclear weapons. I just think it's an uneven conversation, and it's something that we need to be aware of.
Definitely, definitely. Thanks so much. And I think that gets to some of the work. You know, we're here because we're talking about what we can learn. And one of the things that I know that both Scott and Ola have worked on in their social justice movements is the ways that intersections have affected their work as physicians. Do either of you want to talk to the ways that you've had to deal with equity issues or the ways that you've had to deal with these intersections from a medical standpoint as you've been working through these social justice moments? Scott, I'm happy to start with you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks again, just like everyone else has said, for having me be a part of this. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, I think, do you mind repeating the question or specifically talking about kind of the intersection and how equity plays into things?
Yes, exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think for me in my work, equity is really near and dear to my heart in that personally coming from a multicultural home, I've seen disparities play out amongst my family members in real time and kind of seeing those disconnects that can grow. And I think there are some pros and some cons to kind of this influx of equity work that we're seeing. And, you know, I definitely am a part of that in the work that I'm doing with Medicine Forward. And I think that looking at it from the nuanced perspective, it can somewhat be damaging to have more and more and more organizations, more and more people say that they're fighting for equity, because it becomes difficult to see who is actually fighting for equity among communities of color and low-income communities, and who is really just paying lip service to that. And so I think as we get more organizations and more attention is paid to the idea of equity, it becomes a little bit harder to kind of parse out who is doing what, which I think can sow a lot of mistrust in communities. I know in the medical field, there exists a lot of mistrust already in communities of color and lower income communities, because in the past, we haven't done a good job of treating those communities equitably. So they have a reason to distrust us. And I think there's a reason to be hesitant whenever they hear medical professionals now espousing this idea of equity within communities. So I think it's really on us to make sure that we are not paying lip service to the idea of equity, but that we're really pursuing these communities and pursuing that idea wholeheartedly. And that's something that is really difficult to do. But on the other side, I do think there's so much value in just having the conversation of equity, because it's something that's needed to be had. And we can see in medicine a long history. I think Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, does a really good job of kind of laying out this long history of mistreatment of people of color in the US at the hands of physicians. And so I think having this conversation is really important, and there's a lot of good that can come of it. It just has to be done in a way where our words match our actions, which I think is what I'm really after and what a lot of other people are after right now.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Scott. Ola, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Sure, and just as everyone said, thank you so much for having me here. I apologize for any background noise. I actually had to scrub out of an OR case really fast, but I'm so glad to be here. I guess just thinking about the intersection between health and social issues, it's everywhere. When we have a patient that comes in and they have like diabetes or high blood pressure, we can't begin to address any of these issues without asking ourselves, within what type of world are they living? What is their housing situation like? because if you don't have housing, it's hard to address any other issue. Going back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those are basic things you need to survive. So that's something to always keep in mind and see medicine through that lens. I've had patients tell me like that they won't take their blood pressure medications because it's $5 for them for the month, and like they cannot afford to use that $5 for that. And so it's important to keep in mind that something that doesn't seem like it would be a big deal maybe for some people could actually be the reason why. And it's not always like patient non-compliance. It's not that the patients aren't like working with you or that they don't care about their health. There's a lot of other factors that are kind of below the surface. Another issue that I'm interested in is increasing access in terms of language and making sure that non-English speakers have the same access to their healthcare needs, and always keeping that in mind as well. Just, are we effectively communicating with these populations? And are we understanding their cultural differences? And even if you're not an expert, just being open to learning and understanding that there's a lot of things you don't know, but there are resources and other people who can help you kind of fill in those issues.
Thanks so much. And talking back to research and how we get back to nuclear weapons, you know, Rayna and Nola, I imagine that in these conversations that you've had as you've tried to make diversity, intersectionality, the importance of other social justice movements being brought into a broader scope as you look for a less monolithic narrative around nuclear weapon abolition, that you gained some level of pushback, that you had to figure out some way to start new conversations so that others would understand where you're coming from and the importance of these issues. Do either of you want to talk about some of the resistance that you were met with, or how you started to work your way out of this resistance into having these more candid conversations as we continue to try and push forward?
I can jump in. I can think of two recent examples, actually. You know, being in a national security and foreign policy, arms control, international security space, having an identity perspective, applying an identity lens to this work is kind of unheard of, you know, but case in point, two cases that I spent a lot of time with looking at are the 2017 and 2020 travel bans. And that was the Trump administration's first national security policy, first international relations issues around trade and the peace accords, Iran, all these like things. And I said, well, I hope that the Trump administration doesn't come in and weaponize identity. And so I was kind of looked at as like, what do you mean? That's not like even a real, you know, IR issue. And the first thing that happens is the Muslim ban, right? So I bring that up to say that it has taken years, unfortunately, for people to understand my work and my perspective. And 1/6 kind of really, I think people started to think about my work very differently, because that was a very clear example of identity and national security clashing, right? And so I get a lot of pushback, and even my stance with let's be careful with China. You know, you have different people in the community who are pro-proliferation. You have folks in the community who are pro-modernization. You have folks in the community that are pro-disarmament, and there's disagreement that we should be cautious when it comes to running into the rhetoric of a new Cold War. And then there are those who think we're already there. I said that earlier. And so when I say things like, yes, but we need to be careful about our biases when we're thinking about these policies, for some reason, that perspective is not taken into consideration other than, well, China's our competitor, right? But also going back to a very recent example with COVID, the anti-Asian sentiment in our country and around the world, again, are examples of identity and national security clashing. This is a real thing, and we need to be very careful when we bring biases into the policymaking space. So in terms of resistance, I mean, I live it every single day. One of my friends, one of my girlfriends who's on the call right now, Shirley, we had a recent run-in with someone on LinkedIn trying to demean our qualifications in a national security space because we were talking about DEI. And it's just always constant examples, especially being a Black woman with locks, in this space talking about identity. There's tons of pushback, but it's okay because I understand my role in this community, and I am going to keep raising the alarm about identity, national security, foreign policy, because it's important. We all have a stake in this democracy. We are all in it together. So I think that everyone's voice should be heard.
Thank you so much, Nola. As a Black woman with locks, I appreciate that. Rayna, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond as well.
I feel like Nola pretty much said it all. But if we look a little further back, you even see with the lead up to the war in Iraq and the way and the language that was used to describe individuals from that region. And even when you look at like the axis of evil and the people who were like considered evil didn't look like the person who espoused this rhetoric. And so I think it's important that when we, like as policymakers, as decision makers, as everyday citizens, when we are listening to the words that come out of those who are in power, those who have the ability to decide like how much is being spent on our defense budget, the types of money that's donated to countries, the types of weapons that end up in countries, that we have to be cognizant of the fact that their unconscious bias will always play a role unless they do the work and to like address it. I had an issue as a master's student when it came to unconscious bias from an individual you wouldn't think you would normally have that issue with. But it's important to realize that it can either be like a learning a bit, like something that allows you to learn from it and grow from it, or something that will hold you back. And so in that sense, I think we have to be aware, like look at the things that we've done in the past, because oftentimes we will do it again in the future. And so I just think that it is important to like have the conversation, to know what it is that we're doing, to be aware, because oftentimes people are like, well, I just didn't know. But if you didn't try to know, if you didn't do the work, then you are just as, in my opinion, you're just as guilty as someone who outright did wrong and didn't care.
That's a really important distinction. And I think people often get caught in a loop about intention in your actions because there are real ramifications either way. Scott and Ola, I know you both have spent extensive time organizing in diverse communities and especially with youth. Can you talk about effective ways that you guys were able to communicate with such diverse populations, or strengths that you feel like you've taken away from those experiences that as we do this work in nuclear weapons abolition, you think might be beneficial? Scott, I see you nodding your head, so I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely speak on this, especially kind of from the perspective of, looking at health professionals and health professional students, since that's what I work with the most. And I think in thinking of strategies, really my first thought is less of a concrete strategy and more of a mindset that I've found to be really key in influencing whatever strategy comes out of that. And I think that with whether it's just younger people in general and specifically with younger individuals in the health field, I think it's really important to understand the culture and the environment in which we operate, especially as a medical student right now and going to be a resident and speaking to residents and things like that. It's just a very different world than most people operate in on a daily basis. And I think that generationally, we see that as well. And people growing up with cell phones, iPads, everything from birth versus those who maybe didn't really deal with the technology like that until they were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. And so I think the first step in really developing strategies to reach these type of demographics is really a mindset of going into it, wanting to understand the culture and wanting to understand the environment and wanting to understand the specific challenges that we may be facing kind of in that demographic. And going off of that, I think what I've really found most effective, especially being a part of a newer organization and organizing, is really starting at the personal level. I know social media is huge. It runs a lot of what happens in the world and probably runs a lot of our thoughts more than we'd like to admit. But I found that connecting at the personal level first, whether that is me talking to someone I know or maybe that's a second degree, third degree connection, whatever it is, but making a personal connection and actually speaking to a person over a message or video call or phone call or in person or whatever it is has helped our organization grow so much more and has made it so much more sustainable than our social media outreach has. And I think I've really found that starting with that personal connection before moving on to the bigger, grander social media campaigns and things like that has really been effective because it's really easy as a young person myself and as someone who's in medical school and all the things. I get bombarded every day with just so many emails, so many messages of organizations at my school, organizations nationally, things like that. It's really kind of easy to filter out that noise, but it's a lot harder to do that when someone is personally reaching out to me and making that personal connection that understands the environment in which I operate.
Awesome, thank you. Ola, do you want to talk about your experience?
Sure. Something I think that's important to remember when you're trying to get people involved with a specific type of social justice movement is to be flexible in how people carry out the goal. I guess there's a lot of different ways people can work toward the same kind of objective. And so by letting people be creative in that, I think you allow their own strengths to come out and it builds a more effective movement. This actually happened to me and my other 3 medical students who are involved with Healthy Beats, which is the bi-monthly education program we host at Deborah's Place, which is like a housing shelter for women in Chicago. The structure of the program prior to us taking it over was very traditional. There were lectures and then there was like a Q&A session. And when we took over, we just felt kind of uninspired and I don't know, we were a little confused with what to do. And so we all just decided to tap into what we're passionate about. So one of the students had been a yoga instructor prior to medical school. So she started to incorporate like chair yoga into wellness. Another one was like a painter. And so she did some like art classes and art therapy. Actually, as my bachelor's, I did environmental science. So I'm very interested in environmental medicine and how like pollutants impact like long-term outcomes. And so we talked about sort of like sources of pollution in our community. What are some of the issues facing the women in Deborah's Place? How could that be impacting their health? And so by tailoring that to what we were really passionate about or what our skills were, I feel like it improved how successful we were. So just keeping that in mind, also remembering that everybody is like crunched for time. Everybody's busy. So making sure that opportunities are accessible and manageable is very important. So starting off with open communication about what expectations are, what the commitment looks like, and allowing people who are involved in the movement to feel comfortable reaching out to you, saying, I can't do this week because, I'm really busy. How can I get involved later? And just making it not very strict, because I feel like program or movements that adhere to like, oh, you need to come in, 4 times a month, sometimes can make people feel like, okay, well, that's too much. And even though they're passionate about it, it can kind of push them away. So making it easy for people, I think, is a good way to retain advocates.
It's a great point, Ola, that you just made about meeting people where they are. I think often we've had conversations in the nuclear weapons abolition movement where we found an inability to understand that not everybody has the same issues at the exact same moment. So we must find a way to meet them where they are. And that comes back to Rayna and Nola, and it's a question in the conversation that I see spurring in the chat, especially that started with Jermaine's question, is how do we build consensus? How do we bring other groups into this conversation in a meaningful way that creates a movement that all people feel like they are heard, and we are recognizing the myriad of things that are necessary for all of us to move forward? What do, Nola, Rayna, what do you think as we start to think about building a larger, more inclusive coalition of the work that we're trying to do here?
I'll take the first stab at it. I think it's important to look at what we all have at stake when it comes to nuclear weapons specifically, but weapons, the arms race in general, and that the average person thinks because nuclear weapons have existed for so long and have become something that most people just don't think about as in something that comes up in general conversation, or in the same way that say climate change does, because literally you're seeing it's Cleveland yesterday, Cleveland, Ohio. It should be snowing in November in Cleveland. The other day it was 70 degrees. And so you see the effects of climate change playing out right in front of you, where with nuclear weapons, you don't see that. And so it's not at the forefront, but if we have those conversations where I think it was Mary Dixon who talked about on indigenous lands here in the US, that you have uranium mines that weren't properly sealed, that there was spills that went into rivers. The water sources have been polluted, which goes into the health and environmental issues, that this isn't something that should be left in the hands of just government. This is a conversation that needs all hands on deck. And I think the best way is to do that a lot through education, because this isn't something that, you can see with your own eyes unless you live in those communities that have been affected, or you're around people who have these kinds of discussions. Education start out early. I learned about science, one of my first instances of hearing about science was, besides in school, was the Magic School Bus. I love Miss Frizzle. She was my girl. But those simple ways of bringing it into everyday conversation, so that way people see that, this isn't so big of an issue that I can't help with. If you approach it from a fear-based point of view, eventually people are going to be turned off. They can only function with fear for so long. And then once that happens, you are either spurred to continue on, or you're there's nothing I can do. It creates a sense of hopelessness. But if you create education, you show, okay, these are things that we can do. These are coalitions that we can build, either through environmental, through social justice. I remember we had, actually he's on the call, Vincent and Sunday, come and speak at our school last year. And he discussed how during the civil rights movement, there were many who were aware of the necessity to continue to push for disarmament of nuclear weapons, that were civil rights leaders or members of the civil rights movement. And it's not siloed. How it affects one group of people will have those same types of effects on others. And so, in the sense that nuclear weapons, though, have been they are indiscriminate in their damage. And so these conversations and the ideas and the work that can be done, though can seem daunting, it's not as difficult as long as you approach it from a place of, okay, we can get there. It might not be in my generation, but if we continue to do the work, it might be the next generation or the generation afterwards that finally reaches zero.
Okay, I want to start by saying I am pro-abolition. My next point is going to be, I'm probably going to offend Stephen. I see his comment about the role that policymakers and academics have played in all of this. But I also need to speak from my position as, you know, someone in international relations. And here's the unfortunate thing. America is no longer the sole superpower. That is an unfortunate truth. And why that is important is because states that are nuclear capable, like Russia and China, North Korea, democracy is the last thing that they're thinking about. And the reason why I keep situating democracy is because inside of democracy, there's a concept of coalition building, right? There's this idea, I don't know if we do this well in practice, there's an idea of inclusiveness, okay? So when you are competing with nuclear states who are dictatorships, and who rule from power, that is the starting point. The starting point is power, right? So now we are in competition, a different type of competition, where democratic ideals are just not important to some of these regimes, right? So what do you do in that case? Do you lean more into the abolition movement? I wish yes, but I don't think realistically that is what's going to happen, simply because I don't know how many people in this room know a lot about hypersonic missiles technology, but the successful test that China did last month, I mean, this thing can evade radar and our defense systems won't detect it, okay? When Russia had its first hypersonic missile program that was abandoned in 1983, at least with that kind of early hypersonic tech, there was a 15-minute warning that the US would have if they launched that missile. That is not the case today. So realistically speaking, I do not see anyone in the national security space that is going to not think about that. That's going to keep them up at night. General Milley said that it was very concerning, you know, and that's very kind of in very coded military speak, like, you know, like this is did y'all see what just happened? You know, like he's raising the alarm, and I don't think out of fear. Now, where I think fear plays, and I'm also going to bring in social justice movements too, but I want to talk a little bit about fear. Jorge had asked a really good question early on about there was more awareness during the Cold War about nuclear weapons. Well, a lot of that because there was a lot of, you know, fear-based propaganda from our own state that made people fearful, right? And there were bunkers built, children had drills in school, like all of these different things. I hope that we do not get to that space again, but I recently put some questions on a survey, some national security questions on a survey, and asked people, how do you think and feel about national security and foreign policy? And overwhelmingly, the response was Americans simply do not think about national security and foreign policy issues. We do not. We are bombarded with domestic insecurities. We are bombarded with them in our everyday lives: inequality, climate change, nationalism, white supremacy, economic disadvantages and unfairness and gender issues. There's so much in our everyday lives that we are thinking about. The last thing you want to also now think about is China and their hypersonic missiles, you know, and that's just a reality. There was also a very similar survey fielded in the UK where UK citizens don't think about national security either. So that kind of disconnect in terms of what individually we care about is part and parcel as to why many Americans aren't talking about this every day as an existential threat. And in terms of, someone asked a really good question about the way that BLM was able to mobilize. I think when you have issues that are closer to home, you know, when you have domestic concerns that are impacting your everyday life, you know, around, you know, policing issues, tainted water, you know, like things that impact your everyday life, it's different. You know, the fact that we call this existential means that it's something outside of yourself. It's something so big and so serious that it is sometimes you just don't know what to do. That's kind of more the philosophical concept of existential. But I think that is a huge kind of like signal that no, people are not thinking about existential threats every day. They are thinking about not getting pulled over by the cops and not being shot. They are thinking about how are they going to compete with inflation. You know, they are thinking about, I don't want to go to this job and make minimum wage. They're not thinking about national security and foreign policy issues, you know, and I don't know I don't know if it's a good idea to build a huge groundswell around nuclear abolition just because I'm a strategist. So you have to game this thing out. That will cause the fear. You know what I mean? Like in terms of massive groundswell support will, I think, probably, you know, push us back to a time where the Cold War, where people were going to sleep afraid that they were going to get blown up. You know, so that's my personal fear, that I do not want us to repeat some of the things that happened during the Cold War. I truly believe that history is prologue, right? Now, I think that these powerful organizations and coalitions, I think that they need to, I think that in terms of coalition building, that it's going to be in that arena. It's going to be in that arena, because if we start scaring people on the ground and they're already so stressed about their everyday lives, I don't know what positive purpose that will serve. So those are my few points.
Thank you, Nola. They were important, very important viewpoints. And I think one of the points that you touched on that's really important as I think about some of the work that Scott and Ola have done is how do we make nuclear abolition a proximate issue to a myriad of different groups? How do we make it a conversation that is close to home, especially for groups that have other issues that are more pressing to them? And I know Scott and Ola, you both have had to work in communities where issues look different for different people. And you've had to go in and make things like health and understanding how health impacts individuals important to their people individually and important to their communities. What would you say about how you had conversations with individuals to make these issues important to them? Because I recognize that sometimes when you started to have these conversations with people as not only social justice advocates, but as young health professionals, they didn't know much about the issues that you were bringing to them. How did you make them relevant, or what do you think we could learn from the ways that you have had to have these conversations?
I think a big part of it goes back to what you said about meeting people where they are, engaging what their understanding is of the issue, just having an open conversation about how do you think that this impacts the world we live in or your everyday life, and then seeing from there, like what sort of goals or aspirations do they have for themselves or for their children. A lot of times this comes to play in healthcare when people are like, well, I don't really think about what I eat. I just kind of grab what's fast. And then we kind of talk about, well, what would you like for your kids? And like, how can we take small steps to kind of get to where we want to go? And so I think that that's the most effective way. I don't think it's, super important to understand all the nuances. Like for your patients, I don't need them to understand all the physiology. And I think for this movement too, we don't need to make sure everybody understands all the intricate details, but appreciates sort of the broad picture. Because I think if we get too much into the minutia, sometimes people are turned off and are like, well, this is bigger than me, or like, this is beyond what my understanding is, so I'm just going to tune out. So just making the conversation very like accessible and not non-judgmental, even if people are coming from a different place, focusing on what we have that's kind of a shared agreed upon thing, and then trying to work out the differences versus just like vilifying someone and then putting them in their own corner and then, losing a potential advocate.
I definitely agree with that. And I think about it from a couple of perspectives that I've dealt with one Ola alluded to in thinking about conversations with patients and what that looks like, and really trying to get at the heart of what it is that's going on. And I think Ola put it perfectly at trying to meet them where they are. And I think that's key in organizing and getting people to understand the importance of an issue, and then also to care about that issue, and then from caring to actually do something about it. And I think that meeting people where they are and trying to understand them before getting them to try to understand you or what you talk about is critically important. And I've seen that with patients, and I've also seen it in my work with medical students and residents, and that medicine kind of has this nasty habit I've found of attracting people that care deeply about a lot of things, but don't have the capacity in terms of time or like mental and emotional capacity, bandwidth, or of experiences, or really physical energy to take that care and do something with it if it's outside of the walls of the hospital. There's just a lot that people have to deal with, and working 80-hour weeks or whatever it is, and not saying that those challenges are harder than anything anyone else has to go through, but I think understanding those unique challenges is really important in my work that I've had with students and residents. Is first I need to understand that and understand what they're going through before I can then talk to them about this thing that they may care about, but really trying to take them from here, point A of where they are right now, to point B where they feel that they have the capacity to actually do something about it and actually change it, and not feel that kind of dread or overwhelmed feeling that Ola was talking about, and feeling that it's too big. There's nothing that I could do about it. Or if you're talking to a patient that's too much weight to lose, like I could never do that. Or talking to residents and students of this issue's too big, I can't do anything about it. So I think it's really important to understand where someone is and kind of the capacity that they have in that moment, and groups of people have in the moment of where they are, to help them and kind of guide them, and from that place to caring, and then from caring to action, and really going alongside groups of people and individuals from that caring to that action point, and seeing what that means for them. Like Ola said, that it needs to be a range of things. You can't make the bar of entry too high for everyone, or else no one is going to be involved. So I think really trying to find out how can we get people to see that this is something to care about, and then moving from that to, okay, what do people need to enter into this movement and actually be a part of it? How can we get them to that point is something that I think is really important to figure out for each group that you work with.
That's a really, really important point. And I am sad to let everybody know that we are in the final 10 minutes of our program. And so what I want to do here is give each of the panelists an opportunity to give us final thoughts. I know that right now, at least in the chat, there's swirling conversation about, so how do we move forward? We can't get stuck in what we were doing, because the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and expecting a different result. So how do we move forward is what I will hope that each of you can leave us with as we head into these final minutes. Rayna, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I just think that the best way to move forward is going to require, at least when we're looking at it from a U.S. point of view, I'm assuming most of our audience is from the U.S., that sometimes, especially when it comes to disarmament, that we might have to go at it alone. Like, it doesn't always have to be bilateral or multilateral, especially when it comes to the reduction of our nuclear weapons stockpile. That it needs to be intersectional. I've been watching the conversations that's going on in the chat when we talk about the effects that the nuclear weapons cycle has had on the environment, that it's had on the people who were in areas that have been tested. I think it just has to be a sense that like Masco said, like there isn't a one size fits all There isn't one thing that will change. We need to spend, I am one for spending less on the modernization of the nuclear arsenal. But I know that the US government and many folks there may not agree with that. But I feel like so much of what Ola and Scott have said, that so many of the, and Nola, so many of the issues that face people on an everyday basis doesn't really allow for them to then take on another issue. But if some of that money can be funneled into infrastructure projects, social services, health services, education, that we can begin to like tackle some of these more pressing issues that are existential in nature.
Thanks, Rayna. Scott or Ola, do you want to give us your final thoughts?
Sure, I can jump in. I guess what we've heard a lot about today is just the importance of having social justice movement be a two-way conversation, a two-way relationship, and being open to learning from others. I feel like sometimes if you spend years sort of fighting for a specific issue, sometimes it's hard to suspend your own beliefs. And so there are situations that will surprise you when you have frank and open conversations. This actually happened with one of the women at Deborah's place. We had a whole hour session about how smoking is so bad, ways to quit smoking and all this. And then after, she came up to us and she said, well, I was addicted to heroin for all these years, and then I was able to switch to smoking, and now smoking is the only way that I could avoid doing that. And so we basically couldn't really have imagined a situation where smoking would have been a good for this patient. And so just trying to find moments like that where you're surprised and you are forced to kind of confront how you think of the issue that you're kind of faced with, and then effectively sharing information with people who maybe are not yet on board with your movement, but just kind of trying different strategies. And I think Nola said this earlier, or Rayna, but it's not instilling fear, but kind of making people feel empowered and like agents of change. Because I don't think it should be framed as like a doomsday situation and we're all scared. I think it should be more about, let's come up with an image of the future that we want to work toward together, and how can we take steps to do that, I think is the most efficient way to move forward.
Thank you, Ola. Scott, and then Nola.
Yeah, so I think in trying to ask the question of what to do next, one of the best things that I could think of is more of this. I think bringing in other perspectives into any movement is really valuable. I know I think about it more on an individual level of if I'm in the hospital and in the emergency department seeing a patient, if that patient has something wrong with their heart, I may know a good amount about the heart, or the doctor I'm with may know a good amount about the heart, but they're still going to call the cardiologist who specializes in that one organ to get their opinion. And they may not get any more information. They could just confirm what they thought, or it could lead them down a very different path. And I think that applies great to looking at movements as a whole, is that there's always going to be other organizations, other people that may know a little bit more about something, a little bit more about a specific community, about a specific way of doing things, a specific way of reaching out to people than your own, my own, different organizations may. And so I think that is what I see is really key, is relying on each other, relying on outside resources to put your best foot forward. And also, as so many people have said, really meeting people where they are, not trying to make it seem like a problem that is too big for us to handle, and not getting to the place where we're hiding under our desks every day, again, like we were in the 50s, but really making it a problem that seems attainable to find a solution to, finding out what that is for different groups that you're reaching out to, really getting to know those groups and going after those people with different strategies to see how that they can best help serve the mission as a whole.
Ola, I will give it over to you for a final word.
So first of all, I think that the end goal should be the policy, the international security policy should be peace first. And what I mean by that is we tend to lean into deterrence. We tend to try and guess what our adversary is doing. And in that process, you know, not just the United States, but states in general, it's the constant game of deterrence where you're constantly building up your arsenal, trying to guess what the other person is doing. And so what I mean by peace is I think that broadening the coalition, doing more things like the US participated in the Proliferation Security Initiative on November 1st in Singapore. And there are 23 partner countries signed on to PSI. Now, PSI has definitely taken different forms. First in the Bush administration, right after 9/11, it was strict. It wasn't about multilateralism. It was just more about control. The Obama administration came in and definitely added more of a coalition, multilateral component to it. Trump administration, somewhat in the middle. And I think, but now we're leaning more into a multilateral coalition space. And I think if peace is the goal, you know, if it's not just this constant ramping up, and, you know, we start to think about how do we use different forms of diplomacy to maybe, I don't see states like North Korea doing away with their nuclear arsenal. I just don't. But how do we begin to have conversations about having peace as the goal versus this constant building up of your nuclear arsenals? And the last thing I'll say is, I think that the coalitions need to be broadened. I think that you need to have religious leaders at the table. I think you need to have community leaders at the table. I think that who's sitting at the table talking about these issues and making these decisions, that needs to fundamentally change. Because like I said, we all have a stake in this democracy, and folks that are from other places, you know, you have a stake in the political system of your country. So I think that always having, you know, the drumbeat of war going on in the back of the national security apparatus's mind is perhaps maybe not the way to envision this. I know that the work that we do at WCAPS, we think peace in terms of peace as security, right? In terms of peace as policy. And I think that we need to lean more into that, and we need to broaden our coalitions. And I think those are two substantive ways forward. And thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and the conversation is lit. I wish I could respond to all of it, but it's great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nola. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our panelists who joined and all of you for joining in such an important conversation. This is truly just the start of the work that we're trying to do. This is the start of our Demand Access campaign. We're going to make intersectional commitments to have larger conversations and broader conversations so that we can continue to further our movement in a positive way. We want to thank all of you for joining. As Jasmine said, there's a form if you want to continue to learn more about Demand Access and the events that we will be having in a few short weeks. We would love to stay in touch with you. Please continue to have these conversations outside of this room. Continue to do the work that is necessary for us to find abolition and to find a more peaceful world. So have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.